How's it going, Mark Passmore?
Beauty.
Welcome to Monster Stories. It's a lovely couch you have here.
Yeah, that's what you said.
It is, man. I love corduroy couches. So, Mark Passmore, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're doing in pipe bands and music right now.
Well, I was fortunate enough to enter into a military audition process and got the job as a full-time drumming instructor within the Royal Canadian Air Force.
Excellent.
So that's what I do now.
So what does that look like? I mean, that's your job.
Mm-hmm.
What are your days look like? What are the responsibilities? How does that work?
Well, it's quite vast. It's not like we drum all day, you know. There's a lot of logistics, financial things. You know, when we take a band to do a tattoo and far off in distant country and stuff like that, there's a lot of work to do that. So we administrate all our own stuff.
So you have to do a lot of administrative and organizational
Oh,
duties
absolutely.
as well. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And you guys get to do a lot of those cool tattoos we see all over the world? Where some of the places you guys have played?
We do. Sometimes our own operational stuff at home will dictate how much time we have to go elsewhere. But we do a lot of stuff right on base. Right now I'm at 8 Wing Trenton,
Okay.
which is an Air Force base. So it's pretty neat. You know, you get the helicopters and the airplanes and all that kind of stuff going over, and it's quite the culture.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So if we were to go to a tattoo wherever and one of your ensembles is playing, how will you be listed in the program? How do we know to look for you? What's the name of the ensemble going to be called?
Well, currently it would be 8 Wing Trenton Pipes and Drums.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we got to be looking out for that crew at the next tattoo. Where are you guys going next? What's on the schedule for the rest of this year?
I don't know. The band just got back from the Virginia International Tattoo.
Cool.
It's something that's been a staple of that organization for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm newly posted there.
Okay.
You know, we're hoping to do other tattoos.
That's awesome.
Yep.
So when you and I have had really extended phone calls and conversations in the past, it's always really interesting for me to hear from you about the history of pipe band drumming, specifically as it applies to Canada and Southern Ontario. That seems to be a huge knowledge base of yours, a huge passion of yours. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Whether it's an overview of how pipe band drumming became such a hotbed Ontario, or maybe how it influenced you specifically?
Well, you know, being a Commonwealth country, we're still very connected to Scotland, and it's funny. It was the Royal Canadian Air Force that back in the 50s, someone had it in their infinite wisdom to seek out the best players in the world and headhunt them into coming and joining the Air Force.
In the 50s, this was happening.
Yeah.
Here in Southern Ontario.
Well, here in Canada, but the majority of the postings or the jobs were here in Ontario.
Why is that? Why was it here as opposed to other parts of the country?
I don't know.
Is it just the concentration of bases in bigger cities and all that?
Maybe, yeah.
Okay.
It just so happens, you know, like Ottawa being the capital is here in Ontario. So there was a couple of guys that they managed to rope in. One being John Kerr, who in '53, I think it was, won the world solo title. He was a leading drummer of the Shots and Dykehead. The same as Alex Duthert. Alex didn't bite; he stayed home. And another fella named Jimmy Blockley, who, if you're a jazz student, you'll know exactly who he is. He wasn't in the Air Force long, but that's because he ended up getting hooked up with the jazz scene down in New York and ended up teaching at Juilliard and stuff like that.
So they brought over John Kerr
and Jimmy Blockley.
Yeah. And so these guys in the Canadian Air Force did their research in the 50s, and they said, we want world-class musicians teaching our musicians over here.
Correct.
As a Commonwealth country, we want the best of the best.
Yep.
And those are the two guys. What about in piping? Who do they rope in and who do they bring over?
There was a couple of guys. I'm not as well versed on the piping side as I am the drumming side. But Yeah, we already had a fella named Archie Cairns over here.
Yeah.
So he was out of the Argylls in Hamilton, and I mean, he was a big name. There was a fella named J.T. McKenzie who came over, and we had a lot of immigrants over here that were already in the scene, right?
So people were already piping pretty well.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There was, you know, it's funny. We talked about styles when we've had our conversations, and when I was a young lad, I could close my eyes, and I could tell you what pipe band was marching up to the line by virtue of the style of drumming, and it was more of a wide range back then. From what I remember anyways. So you had your John Kirkwoods, right? And we know John Kirkwood and the whole Kirkwood family. And, you know, he ended up taking over Strathclyde and did all this thing and, you know, some wonderful stuff happening there. We had the Jarvis brothers. We had a fella named Colin Miller. You know, these guys were already well entrenched in the pipe band genre. And then when you know, Harvey Dawson was surfacing, and then when Reed Maxwell showed up, that was he brought a real interesting style to the
Because
field.
he bring over the King style that was well established.
He sure
over there,
did,
right?
yeah. Very lots of flufflams and Swiss. I mean, although we were already playing it, but those guys, from what I remember, were really. And when he showed up, it was quite a thing.
Quite an impact, huh?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
It's amazing how impactful one person can be. One person's music, one person's passion, whatever it may be. I love seeing that. I love seeing that trickle effect. And I think even though when you get into competitive pipe bands, even about grade 3 on up, it can get really intense. I think wherever you are in the world. But if you stop and talk with guys like you realize that there's only a couple lines. It's not like we've been doing this for hundreds of years. We've been doing this for decades. And I think especially, you know, those of us coming from the States, we're immediately impacted by what you guys have been doing.
I mean, you guys have your own heroes. Right,
yeah.
And John Quigg is one of the guys that tend to surface. And I remember talking to John Kerr about drummers and stuff like that. And he says, "Oh, you got to see this fella down in the States, this John Quigg guy. You know, an American rudimental drummer is how he would." And he said, "You know, he's really good, and you got to watch what these guys are doing." Right, and you know, you go into the USAF or the pipe band, the U.S. Air Force there, and they had something really going on.
Boy, did they ever! My goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that Worcestershire band.
Oh yeah, the old Worcester band. Yeah.
Yeah, the Worcester band, and you know, when I was a kid and they'd show up, it was novel to see them. You know, you didn't want them to win, but
wow.
But
what I love telling people, especially United States musicians or people who are new to pipe bands, when they start to wrap their head around the competitive side of things, I think they just assume, oh yeah, there's been bands from the States that have won before, and I say, nope, we won all the amateur grades, we've never won grade 1, but the closest we ever came was the Worcester Kilties, I believe in 57, where they made the prize list, or what would be the prize list today. I believe they got 6th place in 1957.
Right.
And that is the highest a U.S. band has ever been ranked in grade 1. And, you know, for some people, you think, well, that's interesting. I guess I need to learn a lot more about the competitive bands. Some U.S. musicians who are super competitive, you can kind of see them go, what? That's it? You know? And you say, yeah. Let's get on that, shall we?
Well, I've always my father had told me, he says, watch out, you know, that they'll catch up and they'll really, you know, and there's so many good bands that come out of the U.S.
Oh, that's true, and we at least have we have a pretty broad population now. I mean, pipe bands certainly, you know, everyone has problems with recruiting, and that's a totally different topic. But certainly there's thousands of pipe bands in the United States, and that's a beautiful thing to see. But still, I mean, here we are today in 2019, and the Worcester Kilties back in the day, still the highest ranking U.S. pipe band.
Yeah,
Grade one.
they're on their way up again. you
Yeah,
know?
oh yeah. And today
Yeah.
Worcesters are kind of cranking up again.
Yeah.
That's right. So that influencing line again that I think is shorter than we think. Not as many figures as we think. Who do you see as being those influential guys? Help us connect those dots a little bit more. Like we know that Reed played under King, and then Reed has influenced seemingly everyone in the world. What about some of these other guys like Kerr and the other guys you mentioned in Southern Ontario?
Well, John Kerr, that is, he came from the same place as Duthart. Played in the same band, had the same instructions. They both had such a passion for educating themselves, and you can talk about your Patty Donovans and your John Seatons and your Hamiltons and Cathaway and all these guys that go way back. But the way I see it, it was those two guys that really dove into it deeper than anything. They brought rudiments and embellishments to a level that the world.
So you really think Kerr was the guy in North America?
Oh,
first real influential
he was one
figure.
of the guys.
Yeah.
He was one of the guys. And, if you ever study some of John's music, a lot of people dismiss it very quickly because you have to be pretty clever to get through it. And you have to be, your rudimental base has to be very rich. So it's easy to dismiss because you don't understand it.
Okay.
Right? But if you really dive into it, it's something. And I've been very fortunate to play with, I spent 5 years in the Peel Police with Craig Stewart. And then I spent a few years with Michael Hunter, who came over from the Shots and played with the 78th. And you've heard me mention Mike Steele, who was a military guy. And studied with Wayne Jarvis and his stuff. I mean, we're talking opposite ends of the spectrum within our own genre.
Stylistically.
Absolutely,
Okay.
yeah. So, like I said, when I was a kid, I could close my eyes and I could tell you who was coming up the line just by the way they were doing things. And now it's a little harder from a kid's point of view to understand that because the styles are almost homogeneous now, and there's no real holy cow, those guys are out in left field or right field or whatever, right? So that it's almost variations sort of on the same style, but little things that if you're clever enough, you'll pick.
I want to come back to John Kerr in a moment because most of my knowledge of John Kerr comes from Mark Passmore. And I think that's a name that we don't hear often enough, or music we don't know well enough for U.S. pipe band musicians, at least some of us. But I want to center first on what you just said about when you were a kid, you could just hear a band come to the line and identify who they are.
Yes.
And now, even if you're at the Worlds and just focusing on the Grade 1 arena, that's harder to do. I agree with you
if you've
on that.
never heard the band before.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Before it could be like here in Ontario, Georgetown Highland Games is the first kind of Highland Games of the season.
The season opener.
It's
right.
the season opener, and you get there and you spend more time shaking hands, saying how are you and stuff like that. But Georgetown back in the day, called the Speyside Highland Games back then. That's what I'm talking about. You knew who was coming up to the line. Right?
Again, not being in this nearly as long as you have, I agree with you. My first year over the Worlds was in 2007, and I did as much as I could, to play and to listen, and try to catch all the bands practicing all over the place, just really get a lay of the land. And I feel the same thing in these past 10-ish years, that before I could listen in the distance and say, boom, there's Shots, boom, there's SFU. And all the other ones, right? I think that's harder to do now. And yet, our center of pitch is much higher in the pipes, thus the drums. The mid sections are wildly more developed, and rather unique, one would think. Just the overall execution, quality of instruments and gear, everything is better. Everything is improved. You know, all the gear and the instruments that we play, right? The execution, the numbers are bigger. And yet, I agree with what you're saying. The overall sound, the net result of the band seems to be more similar than more unique. So what's the greatest contributing factor there? Is it simply that you could be more individualistic with smaller numbers, maybe a lower center of pitch? Or is it simply the style that is demanded now to do well competitively? Why do we sound more similar now?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that some of the musicians in the first grade circles nowadays, I don't think back in the 80s and 90s would actually make it in some of the grade 1 bands.
Wow. You think it was more demanding?
Because of the smaller numbers, I don't know what it would be, but I've seen some pretty remarkable things out of guys that weren't, really big players on their own, right? But you get those guys that really get the best out of some people. And some people are better at it than others, right?
Sure.
But so I'm just trying to get back to the question,
Why is everything better? Instruments, gear, everything, and yet the sound is more homogeneous.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you talk about music and competition, which we think of sports, right? I think competition is what's made pipe bands what it is today. You wouldn't have that sound that Female has in this sort of thing if it wasn't for that competitive side. But something gets lost. I think people sometimes get wrapped up in the trophy and not the prize, right? So, and I think if you're really good at something, sometimes those two things actually are in the same package.
Yeah.
But I've been in bands where the focus on the trophy was more important than winning the prize, and it kind of takes away from it, right?
I agree, and what I'm worried about is how that often seen attitude or perspective of a higher grade band, how that affects the lower grade bands. You have different responsibilities, right? If you're a grade 1 band, you are the top of the art form. Your responsibility is excellence and keeping the art form moving forward. And like you said, we do that through this vehicle of competition. But it seems to be, I don't know, in a state that doesn't seem to be absolutely positive for everyone involved, including the grade 1 bands. And when you see that trickle down to grade 4 bands or juvenile bands, I think we can tend to lose sight on why we're doing this in the first place. It's fine if you're a grade 4 band wherever in the world and you decide we're going to go to Scotland, we're going to try to win. Cool. But what if you don't? What's your attitude then? What's your perspective on your efforts at that point? Are they just lost? And I've had bands just straight up respond, yes, our efforts are lost if we don't win. That's not healthy in my mind. And so again, I wonder, where is it we're heading? Because I think we all feel it, right? We all feel that there's stuff we need to change in pipe bands. It needs to be led by the grade 1 bands, seemingly. And I don't know what it is that we can do to help steer that ship or to do things in our own bands or our own lives, because there's only 20-something guys steering those ships, So what is it that we can do in our little bands and somewhere planet Earth to help us make good decisions for us that are maybe more musically based or team based as opposed to just chasing trophies?
Yeah, another good question. I don't know. Pipe bands right now, they're pretty awesome. I don't
playing
think,
really well.
I don't think that we're necessarily doing a whole lot wrong.
For sure.
I mean, me personally, I'd like to see it open up a little bit, but it has to be done in little tiny. It can't be too drastic too quickly, right? So we talk about Kerr. there was a time where he came out with alto snare. So half the drum corps was on snare drums, the other half the snares were turned off.
Huh.
So you had a lot of call answer, a lot of duet, a lot of polyrhythms and stuff like that, and it was all based on low hand, high end of the chanter, and it was mind-boggling how involved that was, and that in its day was probably too much too quick. And the same with when he played in the McNish Distillery Band, a grade 1 band here, and he had a fella named I think it was Jerry Radford came out with quints.
Okay.
And he
American quints.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I have to dig into the pictures, but it was a set of
4 drums, right?
Of 4 drums. And if you ever find those old recordings, it is absolutely amazing what they were doing. But again, it was probably too much, too quick. And I think midsections are now they're starting to get close to what he did with that.
Or where he was leaning towards trying to do more stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
So, decades maybe ahead of his time, but that the focus of the pursuit of excellence
and there's
change.
And there's maybe the contrast, right? Where do we have room for experimentation when our only task is to execute and strive for excellence? Pipe bands don't seem to allow for both. If you want to be crowned king of the day, there is no place for experimentation. And yet we know that we want to experiment. We are people. We are human beings.
There is room, but like I say, I think it has to be done in very small doses, right? Pipe bands aren't ready to become like the bands in France. We talked about, right?
No, we talked about that. Yeah,
that's a little too far.
It is, and honestly, let's say there was this hypothetical panel of change, and if I were on that panel, I would not say, "Yep, we need to allow all percussion like we allow in Bagads." In my Bagad, Cap Caval, and all the other Bagads, you can play any manner of sound, but we can't do melodic percussion. We can't do marimbas, vibraphones, and bells, right? But we can do anything else. So we make instruments. We look to other genres for
right. So this quint idea that he used was melodically based.
Oh, cool! So he actually tuned it to the pipes.
It was. It was.
Well, but you understand what I'm saying, right? Like we can do stuff like that, but we can't straight up do marimbas. Point is, we are encouraged to be creative. We are encouraged to experiment, but you still have to execute at the end of the day, and you still very, very strictly, more strictly than pipe bands, must adhere to the traditions of the music and the dance. Because if you don't, you are gone. And so, to me, there's balance there. There's balance in the Bagads of striving for excellence, no matter what grade you're in, and experimenting, being individualistic and creative. I see a similar balance in different ways in a lot of the American competitive genres. Boy, there's high degrees of excellence being called for, especially if you're going to win. But you are required to reinvent the wheel every year. It's a requirement to be creative and experimental. And I'm with you. We can't. Those are extreme circumstances. I think the American marching arts and what Bagads are doing. And I'm with you. I wouldn't vote to have either of those just plopped into pipe bands. It's just too much. But I feel that most people don't know then what to do. Because most of us out here are not in grade 1 bands. But let's take a very specific example from this area. It was the Toronto Police in the early 2000s. Man. And I mean, maybe it's old hat and you guys might be tired of hearing about it. But for us that weren't up here during that time, I remember personally thinking, yes, finally, someone being risky and doing something different, and what a cool thing, by the way. I still love listening to some of those medleys. And
that was driven mostly from the piping side of things. With Michael Gray and I played with Michael in the Peel Police, and he was coming out with neat stuff. But and I talked to those guys that was a tough thing to compose to.
Oh man.
And you can imagine.
Oh man, right? Yeah.
Right. But so
what about that stuff? I mean, that clearly wasn't an answer because it didn't last very long. It didn't stick. It didn't take. I guess maybe that's a good question is why didn't that stick? It seemed so cool as an outsider, someone who wasn't intimately involved with that. It seemed really cool. Why didn't it stick?
And it was good. I mean, it was good playing.
Oh, yeah.
It was clean. The sound was there and stuff like that. It's just, you know, you could use the same thought back with Paddy Donovan, you know, when he first came in to the scene, right? He was turning heads, but he wasn't winning any prizes, right? And there's reasons for that. But
Gotcha.
But I mean, as far as advancing, I mean, where would we had been if it wasn't for, you know, the Paddy Donovans and the John Seatons and all these guys that we mentioned before, right? That pursuit. We wouldn't be where we are if Duthert and these guys didn't study with the Basel guys and and bring it up. So
absolutely,
you know,
it seems that often looking outside our little pipe band genre yields good results when we turn back in. And I don't know, maybe it's time to start doing that again. Maybe it's time to look at these other highly competitive art forms all around the world they're evolving, they're innovating. And it's not that pipe bands aren't. I mean, certainly, I mean, again, the instrument aspects, the numbers, the execution, wow. Is it getting outrageous every year, how good it is. The advancement that I have really enjoyed seeing in pipe bands is more uniformity of technique. That didn't seem to be a priority at all, like maybe in those top 3 groups. Now, I mean, every grade 1 band, most grade 2 bands, you start to see that body language and that physical approach be more similar. And in the States, this is normal stuff for us. If you want to make one of the high achieving DCI groups, and it's been this way for decades, you must first learn the technique and the approach of that group because it's different from that group.
Absolutely.
And so this has nothing to do with marching. This has nothing to do with the visual component because we've put a high premium in United States drumming on your approach equals your sound. Our ensemble sounds like this. Therefore, you must play like this. And I'm seeing that more and more in pipe bands now. And that's a really, really cool thing to see. It's one of my favorite things to talk about with some of those, you know, upper grade drum sergeants.
I think it might be a little more visually stimulating now by virtue of numbers.
Sure.
I mean, studying stick heights and stuff like that was more natural than just by expression and dynamics, as opposed to, I want your stick at this height.
Oh, sure.
You know, much like the DCI guys do.
Well, I mean, and stick height too is different, I think, from physical approach. You can get 3, 4 guys or gals to have the exact same stick height, but have a completely different approach and produce completely different sounds.
Right.
But I'm definitely not just talking about stick heights.
So I do, before we shut down, I want to go back to what you were saying about the grade 4, grade 3 pipe bands. And
let's do it.
And I think that it's very, very important not to be in a hurry with your music, because pipe band drumming, it's not one of those instant gratification instruments. It's not like a guitar where you learn 3 chords and you can sing a million songs, right. Or, you know, Mary Had a Little Lamb on the piano or something like that. Right. It's something that you have to learn. You have to spend a lot of time in before you actually start playing something.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So, I mean, for instructors out there, and, you know, students, don't be in such a hurry, because, I mean, when I was a kid, I wasn't allowed to learn a drum score unless I knew the rudiments. I wasn't allowed to touch the drum until I could play the score.
You had to earn that, right?
I had to earn it, and you weren't allowed to wear a kilt or be in uniform unless you were proficient on the drum. So I think one of the things that we run into is we're in too much of a hurry. Not to take away from obsessive compulsive drumming, you have to do that. Yep. But don't be in so much of a hurry just to get the numbers out there.
It's a tough thing, right? Because bigger bands are more fun and they sound better if everyone's playing well. And I couldn't agree with you more, man. I think we're too quick. As soon as a new person walks in the door, you know, you've lured them in, and then you immediately throw them in a uniform, throw a drum on them, put them out in the parade, and they'll figure it out.
Especially in the lower grades.
Yeah.
No, it's you know, yeah.
So what do you say? What do you say to either students or groups that you work with or that you're able to communicate with? How do you help them to just slow down and make sure that people, learn it the right way and don't have a lot of bad habits to work out and maybe take more ownership or pride in what they're doing?
Well, all the above.
Okay.
Yeah, it's from the lead drummer or the instructor's point of view. If he's worth his weight in salt, he'll understand that. But don't do things just to get the numbers out there. Take your time and do it properly. Yeah. And it doesn't matter if you're playing very, very simple scores. If they're worth playing right. Yeah. And when I hit the parade square, believe it or not, my job in its simplest form is telling people where their left foot is. That's my job.
It's very important.
Yeah, and that's a parade square thing, right? But therefore, you don't see that normal Mark Passmore style of drumming on the parade square. What you see is Army manual. You see stuff out of Seaton's book. Yeah. Believe it or not.
Yeah. That's cool.
And that you're telling people where their left foot is, right? So there's a time and a place for what you're playing. Yeah. And if you're going to, I would rather play a simple. People have a hard time believing this, but I would rather play a simple score very, very well than a difficult score poorly. Yeah. Now I'm always trying to push the difficult. It's not so that it's difficult. It's just a different way of thinking. Right. Those rudiments that I use and stuff like that, they're no more harder than anything else that anybody else is playing.
But they do make you think differently.
Oh no, you have to. Yeah. And I mean, and when it comes to execution, you want to talk about guys here in Southern Ontario now. You look at Drew Duthard's. I mean, you really have to. That's one guy that you really have to commit to. If you're going to play with him, you have to completely forget everything that you've ever known and fully commit to the way he executes things. Right?
And I think you're right. And I mean, I think that's a beautiful thing because that's how you sound like the team, the band, as opposed to you. When you're doing solos, when you're doing recitals, sound like you. Well, when you're in the band, you have to stop your individual pursuits and be like Drew or like Mark Passmore, whoever your lead drummer may be. Do you think is that an ideology that enough drummers have? Are enough drummers approaching choring the right way?
I would hope so. I remember having a conversation with Kilpatrick years ago, and we were talking about the difference, being a core player and stuff like that. And he told me he remembers looking up at Duthard when he played with Alex, and if Duthard went, he'd be looking at him going, the attention to detail at every single level. And this goes back into the way the cores are playing now with the attention to detail at every level means everything from tuning your drum to how you hold your sticks, to your stick heights, how you execute things.
Absolutely.
It's all part of the package.
And these things you do not have to wait for grade 1 to do. You can be a grade 5 parade band and all 2, 3, 4, 5, how many snare drummers you have, or everyone in your tenor corps, you can look more similar. You can feel more similar if that's what you're focused on.
The difference between those grades, like especially in 2 and 1, I think is the attention to detail. That's what makes the difference.
Yeah, not the technical level. I mean, of course, that's there, and that's part of it, and of course, the quantity of repertoire, but I agree with you. Yep. And yet, again, you don't want or need the quantity or the quality of difficulty at the lower grades. It's fine. But you can have that level of precision and uniformity in the way you think and the way you play.
And I mean, when I talk about attention to detail, I mean the way you present yourself. Yep. Yeah. You look at some of these bands, take SFU for an example. When they show up, their ties are done up and their gillies are tied at the same height. Yeah. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
and their uniforms are pressed.
Yeah.
And in some ways, you're winning contests before you actually hit the line
With your presence.
with your presence.
And again, your uniformity, how everyone in your team carries themselves in the same
Absolutely.
way. Yeah, absolutely. I think those are great lessons for any level of band. If a smaller band says, what do we do? How can we possibly get better? How can we be more competitive? We don't have a lot of money. We don't have a lot of time and all these things. Well, there it is. Choose your source, your pipe major, your drum sergeant. They can make good sound decisions. This is how we march. This is how we dress. This is how we play music. And then everyone buys into that. So no matter what you do, even if maybe they're not stylistically sound decisions, they're the same. Mm-hmm. And then poof, you will magically be a better pipe band.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
What else, Mark Passmore?
I don't know.
Any parting thoughts for our monster drummers out there?
No, I'm really happy to be a part of this. I think you guys are on the right track. The world needs more tuition and more education. So kudos on you.
Well, as long as awesome guys like you are willing to share your music and message, we'll be there to capture it.
We'll do some more soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark Passmore.
Cheers.
Thanks very much, man.
Okay.
Awesome.